When I first met him, I expected him to fix things. Not explicitly, but emotionally. I thought love meant having someone who would catch every mood, soothe every insecurity, chase after every withdrawal. I had been trained to see love as rescue. So when he didn't rush in, when I was upset, when he didn't try to instantly comfort me, I felt abandoned. I thought, he doesn't care. But what I didn't realize at the time was that he wasn't withholding love. He was holding a boundary I didn't yet understand. I remember getting emotional one evening, pulling away slightly, waiting for him to react, to follow, to ask, to reassure. But he didn't. He gave me space, not with coldness, but with calm. And that space felt like rejection at first. I mistook his steadiness for emotional detachment. I didn't know how to sit in my own discomfort without trying to make someone else responsible for easing it. I was still looking for someone to regulate me, not realizing how much power I was outsourcing every time I did that. He didn't let me use silence as a weapon. He didn't try to decode my every pause or shift in tone. If I withdrew without speaking, he didn't chase it. He simply waited for me to come back when I was ready to communicate. And that, more than anything, forced me to confront how often I used emotion as leverage, not maliciously but habitually. He wouldn't play that game, and I didn't understand then that his refusal to absorb my emotional chaos wasn't coldness, it was accountability. And I wasn't ready for it. One day I said, "You never try to make me feel better when I'm upset." He looked at me gently and replied, "Because it's not always my job to make the feeling go away. Sometimes it's yours to understand." I didn't know what to do with that. It felt like a challenge, but deep down, it was a truth I had never been told. He wasn't trying to protect me from my own emotions, he was trying to return them to me. And that was the beginning of something that didn't feel like comfort. It felt like growth. At the time, I resented him for not taking on my emotional weight. I thought love meant sharing everything, even the burden of how I felt. But he saw something I didn't yet. That emotional dependency masquerading as intimacy only leads to resentment. He didn't want to be the reason I felt better. He wanted to be the man who stood beside a woman strong enough to meet herself. And for that to happen, he had to stop rescuing me. He had to let me feel it all. Even when I blamed him for it, I used to test him. Not overtly, but emotionally. I'd withdraw just enough to see if he'd follow. I'd speak in tones that implied I wanted comfort, but not clearly enough to ask for it. And when he didn't respond the way I was used to, when he didn't rush to decode or reassure, I'd spiral. I told myself he was emotionally unavailable. But the truth is, he simply wouldn't participate in a dynamic where my unspoken feelings became his responsibility. He wasn't cold. He was just unwilling to enable my avoidance. He didn't match my emotional volume. When I escalated, he stayed grounded. When I tried to draw him into a storm of projection, he stayed anchored in his own clarity. At the time, it felt like distance. Now I know it was discipline. He wasn't ignoring me. He was respecting himself. He wasn't going to lose his center to prove his care. And slowly, I began to see that what I called not caring was actually the deepest form of respect. He was loving me by not becoming the mirror of my emotional chaos. I remember once asking, "Why don't you just say sorry, even if you don't fully get it?" And he looked at me, calm and unwavering, and said, "Because I don't want to create a pattern where I'm responsible for feelings I didn't cause." That hit me in a way I wasn't ready for, because it forced me to ask myself, how often do I ask for repair without taking responsibility for the rupture? He wasn't being difficult, he was being clear. And that clarity, while uncomfortable, was exactly what I needed. He never let me confuse intensity with love. I had learned to equate strong reactions with deep emotion. But he didn't fight, didn't chase, didn't collapse into my highs and lows. He stayed still, observant, present, but not performative. And that was maddening to the part of me that wanted proof through chaos, but healing to the part of me that quietly craved peace. His way of being didn't amplify my pain, it reflected it back to me. And slowly, I started facing things I used to project. When I cried, he didn't always hold me. Sometimes, he sat nearby and just let me cry. That felt cold until I realized he was giving me space to feel without fixing, without turning it into his role. He wasn't avoiding me, he was trusting me. Trusting that I could survive my sadness, that I could move through it, that I didn't need to be rescued, I needed to feel safe in my own emotional skin. And that's what he gave me, not comfort, but courage, not distraction, but depth, not reaction, but responsibility. I used to test him, not overly, but emotionally. I'd withdraw just enough to see if he'd follow. I'd speak in tones that implied I wanted comfort, but not clearly enough to ask for it. And when he didn't respond the way I was used to, when he didn't rush to decode or reassure, I'd spiral. I told myself he was emotionally unavailable. But the truth is, he simply wouldn't participate in a dynamic where my unspoken feelings became his responsibility. He wasn't cold, he was just unwilling to enable my avoidance. He didn't match my emotional volume. When I escalated, he stayed grounded. When I tried to draw him into a storm of projection, he stayed anchored in his own clarity. At the time, it felt like distance. Now I know it was discipline. He wasn't ignoring me. He was respecting himself. He wasn't going to lose his center to prove his care. And slowly, I began to see that what I called not caring was actually the deepest form of respect. He was loving me by not becoming the mirror of my emotional chaos. I remember once asking, "Why don't you just say sorry, even if you don't fully get it?" And he looked at me, calm and unwavering, and said, "Because I don't want to create a pattern where I'm responsible for feelings I didn't cause." That hit me in a way I wasn't ready for, because it forced me to ask myself, how often do I ask for repair without taking responsibility for the rupture? He wasn't being difficult, he was being clear. And that clarity, while uncomfortable, was exactly what I needed. He never let me confuse intensity with love. I had learned to equate strong reactions with deep emotion. But he didn't fight, didn't chase, didn't collapse into my highs and lows. He stayed still, observant, present, but not performative. And that was maddening to the part of me that wanted proof through chaos, but healing to the part of me that quietly craved peace. His way of being didn't amplify my pain, it reflected it back to me. And slowly, I started facing things I used to project. When I cried, he didn't always hold me. Sometimes he sat nearby and just let me cry. That felt cold until I realized he was giving me space to feel without fixing, without turning it into his role. He wasn't avoiding me. He was trusting me. Trusting that I could survive my sadness, that I could move through it, that I didn't need to be rescued, I needed to feel safe in my own emotional skin. And that's what he gave me, not comfort, but courage, not distraction, but depth, not reaction, but responsibility. There were moments when I wanted him to just agree with me, to validate my version of the story, to take my side. But he never did that blindly. He listened deeply, but then he'd ask, "Do you think that's the full truth? Or just how you're feeling right now?" And I hated that question, because it forced me to look past my emotion and into my responsibility. He wasn't there to feed my narrative, he was there to challenge it, not to diminish my feelings, but to keep me from letting them define the entire reality. In past relationships, emotional chaos was a cycle. I'd spiral, they'd panic, we'd collapse into codependence. But with him, I couldn't spiral unchecked. He didn't ignore me, but he didn't chase my drama either. He held up a mirror, not a net. He wouldn't rescue me from what I needed to feel. And though it felt like abandonment at times, I later understood he was giving me back my power. Quietly, consistently, without needing recognition. That kind of love isn't romanticized, but it's transformational. He didn't rush to say I was right. He didn't rush to say I was wrong. He gave me space to sit with my own contradiction. And that space was confronting. I realized how much I relied on people agreeing with me just to feel safe. But he showed me that emotional safety isn't about being validated, it's about being witnessed without being manipulated. His honesty wasn't sharp, but it was direct. He'd say, "I hear what you feel. Now, what are you going to do with it?" And suddenly I realized this wasn't about him. It was about me. He refused to let me make him the villain in moments of projection. When I lashed out because I felt abandoned, he didn't internalize it. He didn't fight back. He simply said, "I think this pain existed before me," and that line stayed with me. Because it was true, he wasn't punishing me for being reactive. He was showing me where I still hadn't healed. Most people would have taken my triggers personally. He took them as information. He wasn't afraid of my edges. He just refused to be cut by them. His emotional boundaries taught me mine. I couldn't dump everything on him without consequence, not because he punished me, but because he modeled something better. He didn't tell me to be strong. He acted strong. He didn't shame me for losing control. He simply stayed in control of himself. And in doing so, he made me question the patterns I thought were normal, the behaviors I once called love. He didn't say you need to grow. But by being who he was, he made it clear if I wanted to meet him where he stood, I would have to. There was a subtle shift, hard to name, but impossible to ignore. I stopped expecting him to fix my moods. I stopped placing my peace in his hands. And it wasn't because he pulled away. It was because slowly, I began to understand that his steadiness wasn't meant to replace mine, it was meant to inspire it. I started asking myself, what am I actually feeling? Before asking him, why aren't you reacting? For the first time, I began to sit with my discomfort instead of tossing it into his lap. That was the beginning of real growth. The more I took ownership of my feelings, the more I noticed how patient he had been, how many moments he had chosen stillness over ego. He could have snapped back, could have matched my intensity, but he didn't. And now, with clearer eyes, I could see that was never passivity, it was leadership. He had been leading by example, without preaching, without teaching, just being. And now, without him changing a thing, I was changing. Not for him, but because the version of me who relied on others to stabilize her no longer felt aligned. We had fewer arguments, not because things got easier, but because I stopped outsourcing my triggers. I didn't expect him to decode my silence. I didn't punish him for not reacting the way I hoped. And in return, he met me with more presence. We started communicating not to fix each other, but to understand. I learned to say, I'm feeling overwhelmed, and I know that's mine to hold. And every time I did, he'd nod, not to dismiss it, but to honor that I was finally holding what he'd been gently returning to me all along. I used to think I wanted emotional fusion, two people so connected they could feel each other's pain instinctively. But now I realize how much I value emotional sovereignty, the ability to be close to someone without losing yourself. That's what he gave me. Not constant emotional engagement, but the reminder that I was capable of being my own anchor. And because he held his center, I found mine. I didn't need to collapse into him to feel loved. I could stand beside him, whole and still deeply connected. That's when I understood what he had been teaching me all along, not through lectures, not through correction, but through quiet, consistent embodiment. He wasn't here to show me how to love better. He was here to show me how to take responsibility for myself. And once I stopped demanding emotional rescue, I realized I had everything I needed. Not because he filled me, but because he never tried to. He left the space open for me to grow into it. And now, I can say without shame I became better because he never took my work away from me. It didn't happen in a single moment, but there was one day that felt like a turning point. I was upset, frustrated over something small, tired, emotionally reactive. Normally, I would have let that spiral outward, turned it into a conversation about how he made me feel. But this time, I paused, I sat with the discomfort. I realized this isn't his to fix. This isn't even about him. And for the first time, I didn't make my emotion his burden. I held it, not perfectly, but consciously. That shift felt subtle and powerful. When I told him, I'm not asking you to do anything, I just need space to process, something in his eyes softened. He didn't congratulate me, didn't say finally. He just nodded, calm, quiet, present. And in that moment, I saw what he had been waiting for all along, not my perfection, but my ownership. He didn't need me to never feel. He needed me to stop projecting those feelings onto him as if they were his responsibility to carry. And now that I wasn't handing them over, there was space between us again, clean, open, honest. I started noticing how often we confuse emotional dumping with intimacy. I used to believe that if I wasn't pouring out every feeling, I wasn't being real. But he showed me that emotional maturity doesn't require constant vulnerability. It requires discernment. Some emotions are meant to be seen. Others are meant to be sifted through privately, not hidden but held. And he never told me to share less. He just taught me by example how to share responsibly, without expectation, without unconscious demand. That kind of emotional independence didn't create distance, it created depth. Now when I speak, it's not from reactivity, it's from reflection. He can trust that what I say has been sat with. He no longer has to brace himself for projection, and I no longer have to fear that my feelings will be too much. Because when you take full ownership of your inner world, something beautiful happens. Your partner doesn't have to shrink to make space for your storms. You show up calmer, more present, more powerful, and maybe the most surprising part of it all is how much safer I feel now. Not because he protects me from my emotions, but because I finally trust myself to hold them. He gave me that by never taking them from me, by never making my pain his identity. He stayed whole, and that gave me permission to stay whole too. This isn't the kind of love that saves you. It's the kind that strengthens you. And once you've tasted that, once you've learned to meet yourself, you'll never want anything less again. The more I stood in my own emotional authority, the more I saw him clearly, not as a man withholding comfort, but as a man who refused to confuse love with rescuing. He had never wanted to be my crutch. He wanted to walk beside me, not beneath the weight of what I hadn't yet claimed. And in doing so, he forced me to grow, not for him, but because I finally saw who I could be without leaning. He didn't change me by demanding more. He changed me by never letting me off the hook of my own potential. I began to recognize how often we mistake closeness for enmeshment. Before him, I thought love meant merging, feeling everything together, solving everything together, carrying each other's pain. But he didn't merge. He stood as his own person, calm and whole. And when I came to him from that same place, calm and whole, we didn't lose intimacy. We found real connection. The kind that isn't built on need, but on choice. The kind that says, I don't need you to complete me, but I want to share what I've built. There's a freedom in knowing you don't have to collapse to be close, that your emotions don't need to take up all the space to be valid. With him, I could speak without spilling. I could be soft without being small. He never used my emotional depth as an excuse to step back, but he never let it become the gravity that pulled him in either. That balance taught me something: sacred presence doesn't require absorption, and support doesn't mean sacrificing your own ground. It wasn't until I stopped expecting him to react that I truly started listening to myself, to him, to the space in between. I no longer needed his validation to process my feelings. I brought them to him not for approval, but to share. And he met me there, not with answers, but with curiosity. Tell me more, he'd say. Not you're right or you're wrong, but simply an invitation to explore. That made me feel seen in a way I never had before. Because I wasn't being affirmed, I was being engaged. And with every quiet exchange, I learned something new about love. That it doesn't always hold your hand. Sometimes it holds the line. Sometimes it says, I'm here, but that feeling, that's yours to meet first. And once you do, once you stop trying to be saved, everything softens. You don't just love the other person more, you respect them. You don't just feel grateful, they become your mirror. And in him, I found the mirror I never knew I needed. The one that didn't just reflect love, but reflected me. I used to confuse his calm with coldness. But now I see it as one of the most generous gifts he ever gave me. Because when I brought chaos, he brought clarity. When I projected, he reflected. When I broke open, he didn't try to gather the pieces. He let me gather myself. His stillness wasn't absence, it was wisdom. He knew I couldn't build emotional maturity on a foundation of dependency. And instead of stepping in to save me, he stood back just far enough for me to rise on my own. It's strange how healing feels like rejection when you're not ready. Back then, I took his boundaries personally. I thought if he loved me, he'd jump in. But now I understand love that respects your autonomy doesn't rush to interfere. It waits, it trusts. And slowly, I began to realize he wasn't avoiding my pain. He was respecting its process. He didn't want me to skip steps just to feel better faster. He wanted me to integrate, to feel it fully, hold it honestly, and emerge stronger because of it, not dependent on him to get through it. He never said, I'll carry this for you, but he made sure I knew he was nearby, close enough to feel safe, far enough to feel responsible. And that distance, that space between us, became sacred. It was where I first met myself outside the lens of needing him to validate or define me, where I began to see that emotional pain wasn't a sign of weakness, but an invitation to mature. And through his restraint, I was forced to grow in all the ways I'd been avoiding. He didn't push me there. He simply stopped standing in the way. Now, when I hold space for my own feelings, I hear his voice, not in words, but in the silence he always offered. That pause before reacting, that breath before responding. that steady presence that reminded me I didn't need to be afraid of what I felt. He didn't teach me emotional regulation through lectures, he modeled it. And the more I watched him stay centered in himself, the more I started to find that same center in me. His stillness taught me self-trust without ever demanding that I become like him. What I once resented, I now revere. His emotional discipline, his calm under pressure, his refusal to let love become a lifeboat for someone unwilling to swim. He never let my waves drown him. Instead, he held the shoreline so that when I was ready, I'd know exactly where to return. That's not distance, that's devotion. And it's the kind that doesn't get praised often because it doesn't look like sacrifice. But it is. It's the sacrifice of ego, of impulse, of the desire to be needed. And it's the kind of love that changes people quietly, permanently. There was a time I thought love meant leaning, that the measure of intimacy was how much weight he could carry for me. But his quiet refusal to become my emotional anchor taught me something deeper. Real love isn't about leaning, it's about learning how to stand. And the more I stood on my own, the more clearly I saw him, not as my foundation, but as someone walking beside me. We were no longer entangled in the name of closeness. We were connected through freedom, and that felt more intimate than dependence ever had. One night, I sat with an emotion I would have once handed to him, confusion, doubt, maybe fear. I didn't reach for his validation. I didn't draft a monologue in my head. I just felt it, I named it. I breathed through it. And in the quiet that followed, I realized I wasn't scared anymore. Not of the feeling, not of being alone with it. And when I told him later, he didn't celebrate me with fireworks. He just smiled softly, like he already knew, like he'd been waiting, not to fix me, but to witness that arrival. I began to notice that the less I demanded of him emotionally, the more freely he gave. Not out of obligation, but out of alignment. There's something powerful about being with someone who trusts you to meet your own needs and still chooses to support you, not because you need them, but because you've created space for genuine partnership. I wasn't pulling at him anymore, and in that release, he met me fully, not because I was broken, but because I was whole, and two whole people can finally share, not seek. Looking back, I don't think he ever wanted to teach me anything, but he did without trying, without force. He just lived by a different emotional code, one that didn't make love transactional or reactive. He never gave just to be thanked. He never responded just to be right. And in his quiet example, I rewrote my entire definition of love. It wasn't about dramatic gestures. It was about consistency. It was about respect. It was about letting someone find their way back to themselves, even when you know exactly where they're headed. I no longer needed him to absorb my pain to prove he cared. I no longer feared that his silence meant disconnection. His strength didn't threaten me anymore. It invited me. And I finally met that invitation. I didn't need him to hold me together because I wasn't falling apart. I was rising slowly, steadily, on a foundation I built myself. But I never would have reached that place without him holding his. And that's the paradox of this kind of love. It doesn't carry you. It stands near you. And in doing so, it teaches you how to carry yourself. What made him different wasn't just how he loved me. It was what he refused to take away from me. He didn't take away the discomfort, the hard conversations, or the weight of my own inner work. He didn't soften the mirror. He didn't hand me shortcuts. He let me wrestle, reflect, and rebuild on my own. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough not to interfere with the parts of me that were trying to evolve. That kind of love doesn't feel like rescue. It feels like respect, quiet, steady, undeniable. He never once said, "I'll fix this for you." Instead, he asked, "What do you need to see that you're not seeing yet?" That question stayed with me, because it wasn't about making the emotion disappear. It was about helping me reclaim my own clarity. He didn't want to be the center of my healing story. He wanted to be someone who stood beside it, quietly believing in the version of me that hadn't fully arrived yet. And somehow, that belief, not spoken but lived, made me want to grow without being pushed. In the beginning, I thought his boundaries were walls. I mistook his self-containment for disinterest. But over time, I realized he wasn't keeping me out. He was keeping himself whole. And in doing that, he gave me permission to do the same. I didn't have to perform to keep his attention. I didn't have to manipulate to feel seen. He was present without being invasive, loving without being dependent. His love didn't ask me to shrink or expand. It simply held space for who I already was and who I was still becoming. The beauty of what he gave me is that I never had to earn it, but I also couldn't avoid the work. He showed up, no matter what, but never as a crutch. He didn't enable my emotional shortcuts. He never let empathy become a way for me to escape accountability. And that was new for me. Most people coddle pain to prove their affection, but he didn't. He honored it, but handed it back. And through that, I learned that real support doesn't mean someone sits in the mess with you. Sometimes it means they refuse to pull you out, so you learn to rise. And now, I no longer resent the moments he didn't intervene. I see them as the places where I grew most, where I finally learned to pause, reflect, breathe, to ask myself, what am I feeling, and what is this feeling asking me to own? His love wasn't reactive, it was rooted, and because he never made my emotions about him, I finally stopped making them about someone else. That was the greatest gift he gave me, not love that carried me, but love that led me inward. Not to depend, but to become. There was no dramatic transformation, no moment where I declared I've arrived. But day by day, I started noticing my own strength, not because he handed it to me, but because he never took it away. I no longer waited for him to check in with my feelings. I checked in with myself. I no longer expected him to regulate my reactions. I sat with them, named them, softened them, and what changed everything wasn't just how I handled emotion, but how I finally believed I was capable of holding it. He had always seen this version of me, calm, centered, clear, even when I was stuck in reactivity. He never tried to mold me, never told me who to be. He simply modeled wholeness and let me catch up in my own time. And now that I had arrived, not as someone he sculpted, but as someone I reclaimed, I saw it for what it was, a deep, sacred form of love, the kind that doesn't make you in its image, but calls forward the version of you that you buried under fear and habit. That's what he gave me, space to remember myself. He didn't give me strength, I built it, brick by brick, by learning how to sit in discomfort without flinching, to speak without attacking, to listen without defending. And the more I practiced, the more our relationship softened, not because the challenges disappeared, but because the tension between us dissolved. He no longer had to hold a line. I held my own. He no longer had to mirror maturity. I met him in it. Suddenly our connection became not a balancing act, but a rhythm, one built on mutual mastery. I remember looking at him during an argument, an old trigger rising, the kind that used to spin me into blame, and this time I paused. I owned it. I named it. I said, "This isn't yours, and I'm not asking you to carry it." The look in his eyes, it wasn't pride, it was recognition, like he'd always known this version of me was there waiting. And in that moment, I didn't just feel strong. I felt seen, not for the performance of healing, but for the quiet work it took to get there. And he met me as he always had, not with praise, but presence. This is what love becomes when you stop needing to be saved, not fireworks, not drama, but deep, unwavering respect. He never asked me to owe him anything for what I'd become. He never said, "I waited for this." He simply stood beside me like he always had, not as the hero of my healing, but as the mirror that never cracked, even when I did. And now that I'm whole, I can finally love him, not from need, not from fear, but from truth. And that kind of love, the one born from personal responsibility, is the kind that lasts. He never once said, "I made you better." That was never his goal. He didn't love me as a project. He didn't wait for me to transform so I could become easier to love. He loved me through my unraveling, not by pulling the thread, but by refusing to tie it for me. That's why it worked, because he didn't try to author my healing. He simply made sure I had the space, the safety, and the silence to do it on my own terms. And in that quiet, I met myself fully for the first time. Now, when I think about all the moments I begged for comfort, for reassurance, for emotional hand-holding, I realize what I was actually asking for, a break from the discomfort of my own growth. But he didn't give it to me, and I'm grateful, because in that discomfort, I found clarity. In the space he held, not with words, but with discipline, I built endurance. And what I used to call distance, I now call devotion. He stayed true to himself, so I could find what was true in me. That's not just love, that's legacy. There's something powerful about being with someone who doesn't try to complete you, but who refuses to let you stay incomplete. Not through pressure, not through control, but through standard, through steadiness, through quiet presence that asks, "What part of you are you still handing away?" He never asked for more than I could give, but he never let me give less than what was real. And in doing that, he gave me something no one else had: a relationship that wasn't about dependency. It was about dignity. I used to think I'd know I was loved when someone held me at my worst. But now I know I'm loved when someone doesn't take my power away, even when I'm messy, even when I'm unsure. He never silenced my storms, but he never let me drown in them either. He waited for me to swim. And when I did, he didn't say, "I knew you could." He just kept walking beside me like nothing had changed, because in his eyes, I had always been capable. I just needed time to believe it myself. So no, he didn't teach me how to love him. He didn't even teach me how to love better. What he taught me was something far more valuable: how to take ownership of my own heart, my own voice, my own healing. He didn't save me. He showed me I didn't need saving, and that changed everything. Because once you stop needing love to carry you, you start choosing love that walks with you. Not ahead, not behind, just quietly beside you. Not to complete you, but to reflect who you were capable of being all along.